Mm-hmm. Good afternoon and welcome to the Friday afternoon session of the African American Arts Song Alliance Conference. It's a very great pleasure to welcome Max Jefferson, who is a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley, and her paper this afternoon is entitled Urban Renaissance and the Sonic Construction of a Black Movement.
Thank you. This paper confronts the oppression of the prescriptive generic classification of the marketplace, the policing of performance stages, and the gatekeeping of the concept of art in American music by decentering such actions as narrative motivation. Instead, I turn to Black sites of musical creation in Chicago, specifically Black churches, and their inhabitants that cohered the aesthetic of Black life during urban renaissance in the 1920s through 1940s. In this way, perspective is shifted from racial outsiders to Black musical practitioners themselves. Black art as a function of Black life. March 1925, enter the new Negro. In this essay, Alain Locke wrote of a change that he had witnessed over the previous decade, the growth of a people who could not be accounted for by the sociologist, the philanthropist, or the race leader. These, quote, three norms who have traditionally presided over the Negro problem, end quote. The new Negro could not be accounted for by such societal watchdogs because the new Negro did not fit the formula for Blackness that had long been established in the mind of America. This new Negro was not a problem to be solved or suppressed by society. The new Negro was more than a concept to be considered. The new Negro was a mass, each of its members representative of a Black modernism, each Black person an identity growing from within. Quote, the Negro of today must be seen through other than the dusty spectacles of past controversy. The day of aunties, uncles, and mammies is equally gone. Uncle Tom and Sambo have passed on, and even the Colonel and George play barnstorm roles from which they escape with relief when the public spotlight is off, end quote. The new Negro was made manifest in Black youth. In Enter the New Negro, Locke invokes the poetic voice of Langston Hughes. In Hughes's poem, Youth, Locke reads the mind of the new Negro. We have tomorrow bright before us like a flame. Yesterday, a night gone thing, a sundown name. And dawn today, broad arch above the road we came. We march. In these words, we hear the ideological transition that shaped the Black movement. Yesterday, the past frozen in the trauma of enslavement, the lens through which the Negro as concept was seen, beyond slavery through Reconstruction. This past was no longer at the forefront of Black thought. When freed from the prescriptive confines of the past, the future became a place of potential rather than an escapist fiction denied by societal oppression. The suffocating dualism of past and future was defied by a Black youth that claimed for themselves a present. Locke took up the new promise of today as a rallying cry for Black youth. Quote, the popular melodrama has about played itself out, and it is time to wrap the fictions, garret the bogies, and settle down to a realistic facing of facts, end quote. This ideological transition to Black modernist thought and cultural production is made evident in the transition from the predominance of the spiritual to that of gospel music in the community spaces of the Black Renaissance in Chicago, namely Black churches. The new Negro arrived in northern urban spaces, predominantly Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, St. Louis, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Indianapolis, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Oakland, Phoenix, Seattle, and Portland, after leaving the rural South in the name of opportunity and employment. Before the time of this great migration, 90% of Black people in the United States lived in the South. Journalist Charles M. Blow notes that while Black people did not move north even during Reconstruction, it was first the Homestead Act of 1862, which culminated in a mass exodus north by roughly 27,000 Black people seeking relief from the violence of oppression. And second, the Great Migration itself, broadly happening in two large pushes coinciding with World Wars I and II, which brought Black people north by the millions. The multi-part northern push by Black people, as detailed by Blow, becomes an important narrative organizational factor that complicates the concept of Black youth as written by Alain Locke. When considering the beginnings of Black migration as within a 19th century context, we are faced with the fact that the young do not maintain their youth in perpetuity. Perhaps Black modernism was born in the simultaneously geographical and ideological push northward, shaped and recorded by the likes of Locke or Du Bois or their contemporaneous Black intellectual counterparts. But Locke was well into his 50s when his anthology, The New Negro, was published. Du Bois, his 70s. Both men representative of an Ivy League-educated Black intelligentsia whose artistic ideals called for Black elevation that was not necessarily the priority of the New Negro, whom they theorized and called to arms. In complicating the definition of youth and bringing specificity to the movement and activities of Black community leadership during the Black Renaissance, I reject the existence of a monolithic Blackness, an unchanging movement spanning decades, folding together beginnings, ends, and all that lies in between. Such a monolithic Blackness would allow for the construction of yet another formula of objectification that denies the agency of Black people. Black Renaissance was not a movement that brought together the likes of Du Bois and Locke, Hughes and Dorsey, Baldwin and Baraka. These leaders, thinkers, artists, represented multiple generations of Black existence, beginning with the push north by Black people endeavoring in the name of their own individual potential, and eventually giving birth to the generation of the Civil Rights Movement, each generation not only growing within, but changing their own contexts, developing and compounding the work of those who came before them in the name of agency for Black people in each contemporaneous present. There's a difference between the seminal Black youth who forged Black modernism and the youth born of it, who in the 1930s and 40s were indeed the new Negroes of Black Renaissance. It is this difference that I read and hear in the transition of the predominance of the spiritual to that of gospel music in the Black community spaces of the Chicago Renaissance. Allowing for this complication of Locke's concept of youth, I argue that gospel is not only a musical residue of a Black social movement, but the sonic evidence of this social movement with which it is co-constitutive. Multi-generational musical practice to match a multi-generational Black movement, none of which deny the past, but all of which claim their own present, and in doing so, build a future based on the fulfillment of Black potential. In this presentation, we will hear the growth of two generations in the music of the spiritual and the music of gospel, listening to the sounds of each and how they represent the people, representatives of whom I will track within their own contexts, who were constructing musical praxis based on lived social ideology. In her biography of Harriet T. Burleigh, Jean Snyder considers the change in Black artistic production as young Black artists were drawn to New York and Chicago. She writes that these voices called for Black art and artists to, quote, affirm their own aesthetic values and to draw on the language, oral literature, and music of the folk for their forms and aesthetic principles, not merely as raw material that needed to be transformed into high art to be worthy, end quote. This movement was in direct opposition to the artistic expectations of the early leaders of the New Negro movement, who sought to, in their words, elevate Black art to more esteemed spaces, to promote the validity of both the art form and the creative minds behind its artistic production. Harriet T. Burleigh, born December 1886 in Erie, Pennsylvania, was a classically trained composer and singer well known for his hand in introducing Antonin Dvorak to Black music in the United States. Through the time of Black Renaissance, Burleigh and his spiritual arrangements were most often performed for concert hall audiences. These audiences all thrilled by the emotionally evocative, yet, particularly to cultural outsiders, simplistic songs that allowed them to claim insight to the connection of Black people to a religious higher power. Such reviews were printed in 1923 after a performance by Roland Hayes of Burleigh's Go Down Moses at the Boston Symphony Hall by Haywood Brown, who wrote, quote, Roland Hayes sang of Jesus, and it seemed to me that this was what religion ought to be. I saw a miracle in the town hall. Half of the people who heard Hayes were Black, half white, and while the mood of the song held, they were all the same. They shared together the close silence. One emotion wrapped them, and at the end, it was a single sob, end quote. The following is a recording of Burleigh singing his aforementioned arrangement earlier in 1919. I'll be playing both this recording and the one that will come later in their entirety. Besides the fact that I find doing so enjoyable, I believe this listening practice will highlight distinctions between the two styles. Both songs are strophic, which at first might make it seem odd to play them all the way through, but it is the treatment of the form in poetry that I find interesting. Listen to the piano. Hear the only accompaniment to the vocal line. Listen to Burleigh's adherence to the melodic line, to the training present in the quality of his voice. More frequently, on mainstream concert hall stages, spiritual arrangements were programmed that were perceived as more quote-unquote authentic in the perceived quasi-primitivity of their styling, bringing such old Southern style traditions of lining out or real Negro harmony, as it was put, that prioritized the Black voice accompanied by simple to even non-existent accompaniment. The lyrics of such spiritual arrangements rang of the fixation upon past trauma that was evident in ideology, artistic or otherwise, of pre-Black modernism. While the sound of this Burleigh arrangement is not always continuous with the settings of spirituals representative of his earlier work and other arrangements performed beyond the concert hall, it does speak to the tastes of a public concert stage governed by white stylistic ideals and Burleigh's desire to make Black music intelligible, this time his word, to his desired audiences. In this, Burleigh found himself at odds with Black Renaissance artists such as Langston Hughes, some 35 years his junior, who did not feel the need to translate Blackness for the sake of an audience. In his essay, published in The Nation in 1926, Hughes wrote, calling on other Black artists to express their, quote, individual dark-skinned selves without fear or shame. If white people are pleased, we are glad. If they are not, it does not matter. We know we are beautiful and ugly too, end quote. He goes on to express his lack of need for approval from Black audiences as well, in what seems to be both the desire to create art of his own accord, but also to reject the perceived need for so-called elevation of Black music that was called for by the likes of Burleigh, Hayes, and other Black musicians of the mainstream concert hall. Yet, quote-unquote high art concert hall stages are not my concern, not today. Though I would like to take this knowledge of the concert hall and the perception of Blackness present on its stages and turn toward Black church spaces in Chicago. Spaces that experienced a vast and unprecedented insurgence of parishioners due to the migration of Black people to northern cities. In these spaces, leaders such as Du Bois emphasized a formula of morality that defied the white assumptions about Southern Blackness, a formula much like that which is written against in The New Negro. Among other social constructs put into place by Black church leadership, music was a primary mode of expression, but also a social pedagogy deemed fit by those community members in command. In Devarian L. Baldwin's monograph, Chicago's New Negroes, he interacts with Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk, in which Du Bois, quote, made clear that because the variably termed Negro spirituals, slave songs, or sorrow songs were produced in the bowels of a contradictory American slave democracy, they contained a message of longing toward a truer world, end quote. Du Bois believed the spirituals born in slavery, while perhaps not representative of his own black existence, were undoubtedly the kernel of folk identity that, through the expert tailoring of his contemporaries, would become expressive of the changing black people he sought to cultivate. Baldwin finds in Du Bois a conclusion the social leader carried with him past the 1903 publication of Souls of Black Folk, in which it was initially written. Du Bois concludes that the redemption found within spirituals, quote, was the singular spiritual heritage of the nation and the greatest gift of the Negro people, end quote. Du Bois believed that other song formations such as gospel, which he viewed as harmfully derivative of the spiritual, to be, quote, debased imitations of Negro melodies made by ears that caught the jingle but not the music, the body but not the soul of Jubilee songs, that well nigh ruined the black sense of song, end quote. Black community leadership aided musicians such as Edward Boatner, who they believed struck a balance between cultivation and preservation, to publish his collection of spirituals entitled Spirituals Triumphant, Old and New, which collected compositions and arrangements that were, quote, racially distinct in content while extolling the same ends of physical restraint that European classical music demanded, restricting the choir to the notes on the page and the commands of the director. DeVary and Baldwin referred to this performance style as a fixed, self-contained cultural product with little room for a response or interpretation by the congregation. To be clear, I do not mean to suggest some Foucauldian means of control or anything of the like. The emphasis on restrained morality was endemic within the Black community of the time. I return again to Charles M. Blow's historical narrative. Quote, relatives or friends, often those who'd sent letters encouraging them to come north, would meet migrants at train stations in Chicago. They would serve as the new arrivals' counsel and chaperones, instructing them on how to survive and behave in the frigid city on the lake. Don't talk loud, don't spit on the sidewalks, dress up for work. If you're reading the Chicago Defender, hide it inside one of the white newspapers, end quote. With the migration of so many Black people to the space of Chicago, racial tensions were at a high. While many Black people lived in an area referred to as the Black Belt on Chicago's south side, some would attempt to venture out to find places to live when the area began to become crowded. Their efforts were met with violence spanning the scale from physical assault to house bombings. The summer of 1919 was dubbed by Field Secretary of the NAACP, James Weldon Johnson, the Red Summer for all its bloodshed. Meanwhile, white people in the city attempted to, quote, formalize and ensure segregation, end quote, with restrictive covenants, explained by Blow as contractual arrangements between sellers and buyers attached to parcels of land that prohibited Black people from using, occupying, buying, leasing, or receiving property in those areas. It was such violence that brought Black people to commune in their own spaces that offered a relative safety in which to exercise their potential as they had traveled north to do. Within the church, leaders sought to guide parishioners in such a way that they might be deemed respectable citizens for the sake of both safety and perceived betterment. Specifically, community members were able to obtain status, quote, through leadership positions in their social welfare programs directed at the poor and uneducated. Many migrants endured social programs on hygiene and domestic arts and sermons on public behavior in order to have access to childcare and job referral networks, while also acquiring social status through attendance, end quote. It was through such upward movement that young church members were able to achieve leadership positions within their communities by gaining the experience and education offered by their church communities in the name of morality. Young parishioners were able to maneuver themselves into positions that affected change amongst their peers and colleagues. In this way, the proverbial baton was passed to the youth of Black Renaissance, the true youth, seemingly accidentally. I return to Locke's words from Enter the New Negro. The Negro of today must be seen through other than the dusty spectacles of past controversy. Although constructed with growth in mind, the morality formula of the once young leaders of Black Renaissance were becoming the abstract concepts of Blackness that the denizens of Black modernism were, by mission, set against. One such Black musician that found himself able to effect change within Black church communities was Thomas A. Dorsey, today known as the father of gospel. Dorsey, born in December 1899 in Georgia, had a long journey from his southern birthplace to Chicago in 1916. On this journey that eventually brought him to the Black Chicago church, Dorsey lived in Atlanta where he first learned to play piano. He did receive formal instruction, but his skills progressed into what would become his style, once he found himself on Decatur Street, Atlanta's Black leisure district. Here, Dorsey worked behind the bar at the Vaudeville House, the 81. While he did not have the skills to perform at the club when he first entered the scene, he was able to take lessons from Ed Butler, the 81's musician in residence. He was exposed to the quote-unquote show experience of the Theater Owners Booking Association circuit performers, such as Ma Rainey and Butterbeans and Susie. Dorsey himself gained employment in a series of gigs and musical odd jobs at rent parties, juke joints, and brothels, events that catered to a variety of activities, legal and otherwise, where the imminent threat of a displeased crowd shutting down the scene engendered a quick mind for improvisation to cater to the even more quickly changing moods of his audience. It was these skills, including the ability to swiftly and deftly turn a standard song to appeal to a crowd, that he brought with him to Chicago in 1916. In Chicago, while Dorsey was able to gain the same somewhat high-risk modes of employment, he found here that, as Devarian Baldwin put it, quote, no matter how much these leisure activities helped mediate the city for some, most migrants reserved some part of their lives for God, end quote. So with this, perhaps less than godly, or in the opinion of those such as Du Bois, immoral skill set and geographically diverse experience, Dorsey made his way into the church, where migrants were able to find employment deemed respectable for a mid-century Black migrant in Chicago. Because of the rising of Black youth such as Dorsey and the later dubbed gospel musicians such as Arizona Drains, Elder Lucy Smith, Sally Martin, and Sister Rosetta Tharpe, quote, by the late 1930s, the gospel sound had gone from the devil's music to the most notable indicator of Black Protestant church life, with its own exclusionary rules and regulations of musical authority, while Chicago served as the center of gospel music publishing and performance, end quote. The social work done within Black churches made for not only a contingent of youth leadership within the church, but also was a dominant factor in the upward class mobility of young Black parishioners. With the creation of a Black middle class occurring in such a way, there became a real conflict between the two generations of Black Renaissance. In Rethinking Vernacular Culture, Black Religion and Race Records in the 1920s and 1930s, Evelyn Brooks writes, the popularity of the sermons and gospel songs, emboldened by a youth leadership, contested the ethics and aesthetics of the elder members of the Black middle class, and spoke to the existence of multiple and conflicting subcultures within the Black working class. This conflict could easily be heard in the difference between the spiritual and gospel music, and is for us today present in the following example of Dorsey performing his own song, The Lord Will Find a Way Somehow, compared to our previous listening of Harry T. Burleigh. While gospel is more readily identifiable from the spiritual by its sound rather than its words, I chose the following example because I believe it to suggest the ideological turn toward the present rather than the past-future dichotomy of the spiritual, speaking about the singer's experience, albeit a struggle, of working in his present circumstances. Again, I will be playing the song in its entirety so we can listen to the very different treatment of strophic verse in gospel music as opposed to the more strict spiritual styling. Along with the setting of the lyrics, we will hear improvisation on the parts of the vocal line, the instrumental lines, and the congregational audience, the deep and sometimes discordant harmonies in the accompaniment, the untrained sound of Dorsey's voice as he expresses the emotion of the piece with the manipulation of his own vocal instrument. Altogether, a decidedly unresigned expression of faith and artistry, detailing for us a change in musical priority.
And driven, battered by an angry sea. When the storms of life are raging and the fury falls on me, then I wonder what I've done that makes this race so hard to run. Then I'll say to myself, take courage, oh, the Lord will make a way somehow. Church, the Lord will make a way somehow. when beneath the cross I bow. Now he will take away your sorrow. Just let him have your burdens now. That load that down so heavy, and that weight is upon my brow. But there's a sweet relief in knowing, oh, the Lord will make a way somehow. You know I try to do my best in service, try to live the best I can. Now when I choose to do the right thing, evil's present on every hand. I said to my soul, let it come on my brow. But I say still to my soul, be patient. Oh, the Lord will make a way somehow. Now, often there's misunderstanding. Now, of all that good I do, then I go to friends for consolation, and I'll find them complaining too. Not so many nights I've been cracked, just one this day is gonna rain. But I say to my soul, don't worry, oh, the Lord will make a way somehow. Did you know the Lord will make a way somehow? When beneath the cross you bow, you take away every sorrow, so let him have your burdens now. And the load back down so heavy, the weight shone on my brow. There's a sweet relief in your
I do not view the spiritual and gospel as mutually exclusive. In fact, it is the nature of gospel as a yes-and style that I believe is one of the primary hallmarks of the musical practice. Gospel is not so much a genre as it is a collectivity, an amalgamation of social musical actors, and the music being made in Chicago as a result of the styles and experiences that coalesced in this city. It is why I simultaneously endeavor for specificity within the concept of Black Renaissance, and yet still say the names of Langston Hughes and Thomas A. Dorsey in the same breath. Hughes, a poet endeavoring to express his artistic agency based in his own humanity, despite the judgment of various types of audiences. Dorsey, a showman whose style was born of the skill to play to a crowd for the sake of community enjoyment. Also, even as I complicate youth and make distinctive the work of different generations, I do not wish to deny the impact of those such as Du Bois, Locke, or any other mid-19th century born leader of this movement. I endeavor to deepen their impact, emphasize their historical agency, their legacy. The movement of Black people from the violence of the South to the opportunities present in the North was a push for Black world-making as never had been practiced in the United States. Black people were working in the name of their own potential, taking up space geographically and creating space ideologically, making room for themselves in the fullness of their own humanity, demanding presence in their present. Poet and novelist Jean Toomer wrote of music as something otherworldly. He wrote that, quote, "Music is an almost instantaneous evacuator of inner experiences not being had, not being thought of as possible until the music begins. Add music, and you can instantly transport yourself through inner experience into a different world," end quote. Perhaps that is true for some forms of music, but not gospel. Gospel music was constructed in the mode of Black modernism, rejecting the prescribed Blackness forced to reside in the trauma of the past, and instead speaking to life in their contemporaneous present, not without its hardship, but more importantly, an immediate and real-time expression of Black potential. It is this movement that is described in the work of poets such as Langston Hughes, as I have read earlier, as well as that of Arne Bontemps, who also speaks of Black presence within contemporaneity. Bontemps writes of such presence in his poem, The Daybreakers. "We are not come to wage a strife with swords upon this hill. It is not wise to waste the life against a stubborn will. Yet would we die as some have done, beating away for the rising sun." Like Hughes, Bontemps rejects the wasting of Black life in the night of the past, urging his audience to reject the stubbornness of his forebears. The generation of Black artists born at the turn of the 20th century was born of Black modernism. Leading the Black Renaissance in the light of this new day was their birthright. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for a fascinating and richly illuminating paper. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
I think you have drawn those discrete and yet interweaving lines really, really well in a way that brings both clarity and also shows us the complexity of that. So thank you so much. I have a few questions, but I'm gonna leave some space for other people if they'd like to jump in first. Just as you're welcome to ask a question if you'd like.
You can go ahead first.
Okay, thank you. So thank you. I have a few questions, and I guess I wonder, one of them is that, well, these musical examples that you've played are stunning, each of them in their own ways. And I found myself kind of longing to hear the 1923 Roland Hayes Song of Jesus, and I wondered where you would situate that in relation to the other two examples that you played in the landscape that you've drawn for us.
Absolutely. I honestly only know about that particular example in the writing that surrounds it, so I can't in any accuracy tell you what it sounded like to me. It was a bit of an endeavor finding musical examples, and I think that almost might be for the best, for the sake that it even feels strange for me to play these examples because they are so tied both in my talk and in their performance to their contexts. Mm-hmm. But all in all, I have to say that's something I would have to look into if I could.
Oh yeah, sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I wonder, as you draw this landscape, which I guess travels across an amount of time from the late 19th century up to, say, probably the 40s, but you go a little bit later than that as well. Mm-hmm. I find myself wondering about the relationship between performers singing these spirituals in the concert hall and what you've read out of Langston Hughes' writings. So when he talks about the individual dark-skinned selves and questions of performance practice or various different styles of performance as this is performed in the concert hall. Could you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just because I am limiting my scope to Black churches as faces of Black music making, if you will, doesn't mean that Hughes's ideology should be restricted in the same way. I do believe that his sense of agency, both for himself and as he pushes the artists contemporary to him, are full stop for the sake of agency, not for the sake of agency in any particular space. If that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Feel free. It's totally up to you if you want to keep going.
Maybe one more question.
Sure.
So I guess in a day-to-day way for those musicians, what was the relationship between the church and the concert hall?
I think that very much depends on the individual you're talking about, because as much as I'm talking about different spaces and, again, limiting my scope as I do, it doesn't mean that any of these spaces, music-making people, were existing in a vacuum. It's not a possibility in any form of life, as far as I'm concerned. So there are people like Dorsey who were in church at one time of day and playing a rent party at another time of day, or Burley, who was present in so many different capacities and spaces as singer, composer, etc., concert hall, etc. So I never seek to limit that reality. But again, just for the sake of being able to pick apart one space in one time, for this to be able to dig in a little more deeply to how some changes were made and where this amalgamation, as I said before, of experience and geographical setting and engagement with different parts of society. I just lost my train of thought a bit, but all to say that although I limit for the sake of argument, I do not limit for the sake of their own agency, these actors' agency.
Yeah, I see. Thank you. That's wonderful. I guess I do have one more question, but at this stage we're really down to just my own curiosity.
So maybe should we call it a day with our lovely recording humans? And I'm happy to talk with you as long as we are able.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are we finished recording?
Right.
Thank you so much.
Vast audience. Hello.
Hello, I just want to say hi. I'm sorry, I waited till the end of the class before I came over. I didn't know if they were waiting or.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
I didn't know if they were not waiting.
it's recorded and all.